Hello. I have to say it's been a bit busy few days, and I didn't read the brief for this evening until relatively recently. I read Chris's email and it said hope was the brief. I have a book out recently, available in all good bookshops. I thought I'd just read you a few snippets from some reviews. It's been reviewed. The Guardian, brilliant and depressing. The Observer, unmissable, deeply depressing. The Times, highly readable but thoroughly depressing. I'm thinking of putting that on my tombstone, actually. The Spectator, cynical, depressing reading. I may not be the man to give you hope, to be quite honest with you. I'm unusual. It's really wonderful hearing on Charlie talking about the effect of going to Hay, not being from Hay. I am from Hay. I grew up in the hills just outside Hay. I grew up thinking that a book festival was something everyone had. I can remember seeing Ted Hughes declaiming verse in a hurricane. And I don't know what I was, like 10, 11, and genuinely it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. Coming from Hay is obviously very important to me, and I'm very pleased to live there again. But all my childhood and teenage years I wanted to leave because I wanted to live in Eastern Europe. Particularly I wanted to live in Russia. I love Russia. I lived in Russia as soon as I could. I finished university, I moved to Russia. I lived in St. Petersburg, and then I lived in Central Asia, and then I lived in Moscow. I used to, quite regularly on a Friday afternoon, I'd be towards the end of the working day, and I'd think, sod it, I'm going to go to Ukraine. And I would go to the station, I would buy a ticket, I would get on the train, I would wake up in Kiev, and I would phone my friend Yana and say, hey, I'm here, what are we going to do this weekend? For me, what is happening right now between Russia and Ukraine feels like people from London are killing people in Bristol. It's so terrible. I cannot tell you how awful it is. And I'm sorry, I know you're promised hope, but this is really, really hard for me to give. But I'm used to it. I moved to Russia in 1999, assuming naively that I would be a witness to the democratic transformation of an autocracy, a once-in-a-forever experience to see a people that had never been free become free. And yet I moved to Russia 3 weeks after a man called Vladimir Putin became prime minister, and what I witnessed was not the development of freedom, but its opposite. The few advances that were made in the 1990s in the direction of free media, free politics, free business, were progressively over the next 10, 15, 20 years extinguished. And freedom ceased to be. And instead we see what is happening now in Mariupol and Bucha and all the other places in eastern and northern Ukraine where the horror is currently happening. And you know what? This is our fault. It's difficult to say, but it is. Because there was a plan in the development of Russia. It's difficult to say now because it looks like a bad plan, but it wasn't necessarily a bad plan, and the plan went like this. In 1991, communism came to an end. There was no freedom, there was nothing, but the people who brought communism to an end had a plan. And what they decided to do was to create private property. They were just going to get everything the state owned out the door as quickly as they could to give it to people. Maybe the process would be flawed. It was flawed, but whatever. If there's private property, the owners of private property would now own something. And if they owned something, they would demand property rights. And if there were property rights, they would need courts of law to establish their property rights. And if there were courts of law, there would need to be law. And if there was law, they would demand a say in how those laws were created. And if those laws were created, that meant we needed democracy. That was the process. That was how it was going to work. And it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is because the people who got the property, we now call them oligarchs, the people who got the property, they short-circuited that whole framework by bringing their property here. And we in the UK, we gave them property rights. All they had to do was bring their money here and invest it in football clubs and super yachts and mansions just down the road. And they had property rights that they could dream of. If they wanted courts, they could come here, and our lawyers and our courts happily allowed them to sue each other right here in the commercial courts. And that meant that they could turn the courts back there in Russia, not into free tribunals where they would establish their property rights, but into weapons that they could use against enemies who were less well-resourced than them. And that meant that 400, 500 people around Vladimir Putin now own everything. And they don't just own everything in the sense of property, they own everything in the sense of the security services, organized crime. Everything is under their control. You look at what's happening in Russia now and you say, why is no one speaking out? Because no one can speak out. Everything is under their control. And it is, for me, deeply awful that we in the UK were their favored destination, where they took their money and where they invested their wealth and where they hired lawyers and accountants and, let's be honest, politicians who were willing to allow them to do so. So, where is the hope? Chris asked for hope. The last 6 weeks have been amazing for me because all of the people I've been trying to get on the phone for 5 years, 6, 7 years, to tell them about oligarchs and why we need to do something about oligarchs, they're calling me up. They're asking me for meetings. They're saying, hey, these oligarchs you've been talking about, they seem to be a bit of a problem. Have you noticed they're doing bad stuff? Have you noticed this? Yeah, I had noticed that. Thank you. And we've had sanctions now. We have sanctions. We have assets have been frozen. Property has been frozen. Let's face it, some of the old habits do not, die away. I was down on Belgrave Square recently to see Oleg Deripaska's house occupied by squatters. 25 Met officers turned up, which I think is about 25 more than ever turned up to check the provenance of the money that bought it. But still, we are where we are. And this means the oligarchs are desperately getting their money out of Britain. They're getting their money out of Europe and out of America, and they're taking it home. And if they're taking it home, that means we can restart the calculation from the beginning. And perhaps, as a result of the horror that's happening now, the Russians will have a chance to reclaim control over their own property and build democracy from nothing. That's the only hope I can give right now. Thank you for listening.